I Feel Love, MDMA and the Quest for Connection in a Fractured World by Rachel Nuwer. I had the idea for this book. I wanted to better understand what it was that created the subjective feeling of being on MDMA and how it came to be that this drug, despite its immense and lasting popularity and its clear perks, as I was experiencing directly in that moment, is so heavily criminalized around the world. This to me is it in a nutshell. I have experienced exactly this kind of state, what I call heart alignment, or when your perception switches more to the right hemisphere, described by Ian McGilchrist. The right hemisphere, as birds and animals show, is on the lookout. It has to be open to whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, as much as possible without preconceptions, not just focusing on what it already knows or is interested in. This requires a mode of attention that is broader and more flexible than that of the left hemisphere. There appears to be a clear primary role for the right hemisphere, especially the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. To sum up, the right hemisphere is responsible for every type of attention except focused attention. Even where there is divided attention and both hemispheres appear to be involved, it seems probable that the right hemisphere plays the primary role, possibly that of unifying the divided input, because it is the right hemisphere that is responsible for attention globally. What is new must first be present in the right hemisphere before it can come into the focus for the left. For one thing, the right hemisphere alone attends to the peripheral field of vision from which new experience tends to come. Only the right hemisphere can direct attention to what comes to us from the edges of our awareness, regardless of sight. Anything newly entering our experiential world instantly triggers a release of noradrenaline, mainly in the right hemisphere. Novel experience induces changes in the right hippocampus, but not the left. So it is no surprise that phenomenologically it is the right hemisphere that is attuned to the apprehension of anything new. If it is the right hemisphere that is vigilant for whatever it is that exists out there, it alone can bring us something other than what we already know. The left hemisphere deals with what it knows, and therefore prioritizes the expected. Its process is predictive. It positively prefers what it knows. This makes it more efficient in routine situations, where things are predictable, but less efficient than the right wherever the initial assumptions have to be revised, or when there is a need to distinguish old information from new material that may be consistent with it. Because the left hemisphere is drawn by its expectations, the right hemisphere outperforms the left whenever prediction is difficult. The right hemisphere is, in other words, more capable of a frame shift. And not surprisingly, the right frontal lobe is especially important for flexibility of thought, with damage in that area leading to perseveration, a pathological inability to respond flexibly to changing situations. For example, having found an approach that works for one problem, subjects seem to get stuck and will inappropriately apply it to a second problem that requires a different approach. Or, even having answered one question right, will give the same answer to the next and the next. It is the right frontal cortex that is responsible for inhibiting one's immediate response, and hence for flexibility and set shifting, as well as the power of inhibiting immediate response to environmental stimuli. It is similar with problem solving. Here, the right hemisphere presents an array of possible solutions, which remain live while alternatives are explored. The left hemisphere, by contrast, takes the single solution that seems best to fit what it already knows and latches onto it. Ramachandra's studies of anosognosia reveal a tendency for the left hemisphere to deny discrepancies that do not fit its already generated schema of things. The right hemisphere, by contrast, is actively watching for discrepancies, more like a devil's advocate. These approaches are both needed, but pull in opposite directions. Because the right hemisphere makes infrequent or distantly related word meanings available, there is increased right hemisphere involvement when generating unusual or distantly related words, or novel uses for objects. This may be one of many aspects that tend to associate the right hemisphere with a freer, more creative style. The right anterior temporal region is associated with making connections across distantly related information during comprehension, and the right posterior superior temporal sulcus may be selectively involved in verbal creativity. In the closed situation, by contrast, the left hemisphere actively suppresses the right to exclude associations which are semantically only distantly related. The more flexible style of the right hemisphere is evidenced not just in its own preferences, but also at the meta level, in the fact that it can also use the left hemisphere's preferred style, whereas the left hemisphere cannot use the right hemispheres. For example, although the left hemisphere gains more benefit from a single strong association than several weaker associations, only the right hemisphere can use either equally. Therefore, creativity can increase after a left hemisphere stroke, and not just in sensory qualities, but, as Alajuanin says of one painter he describes, in numerous intellectual and affective components. Certainly there is plenty of evidence that the right hemisphere is important for creativity, which, given its ability to make more and wider-ranging connections between things and to think more flexibly, is hardly surprising. It is a natural state. However, by Western society, in particular the medical model of psychiatry, has labeled these kind of spontaneous natural states as so-called disordered and something to be afraid of. How can nature connection be something bad? When your heart opens up, you feel joy, happiness, inner peace. And you zoom out of experienced stress, triggered by societal pressures and the left hemisphere perception, which is predominant in our society. And it's so beautiful, it's so recharging and nourishing when you feel unconditionally loved, but also are the one unconditionally loving, and everything is just okay. There is no judgment by the left hemisphere perception. It's just acceptance, compassion, empathy. So I feel if everybody in the world would experience this kind of state, we would have way less conflict, way less stress, way less trauma. And to prevent people from experiencing this state of mind, to me is completely irrational and also actually criminal. Making a substance illegal that exaggerates oneness and love. I mean, I just can't wrap my head around that. But then on the other hand, alcohol, who is known to sometimes make people very aggressive, is legal. Does not make any sense to me. I wrote, I feel love with all types of readers in mind, including those who have experienced MDMA recreationally or therapeutically, or both, or neither. Whether you've done MDMA 100 times or 0 times, though the subjects covered in this book pertain to us all. In my reporting, I found that MDMA's ever-evolving story offers a fascinating and sometimes infuriating lens through which to examine the forces that shape all facets of life, including culture, politics, science, and even who we are as a species. I also encountered ample misinformation, including erroneous so-called facts frequently repeated about MDMA in major news outlets, documentaries, and books. I've tried here to set the record straight on what we know about MDMA's history, including by sharing the voices of some key players who are frequently left out, and some of whom have never been publicly quoted before. I've strived for honesty about the drug's benefits and risks by sharing the stories of dozens of people whose lives have been impacted by MDMA, for better or worse, and I have attempted to set realistic expectations for MDMA-assisted therapy by describing the experiences of some of those who have gone through it. MDMA, also known as ecstasy or Molly, is currently still an illegal drug. Yet, evidence is building that MDMA-assisted therapy can help some individuals who are haunted by post-traumatic stress disorder and potentially a host of other mental health conditions. Although there is ongoing scientific investigation into therapeutic uses of MDMA and a public conversation about decriminalizing or even legalizing the drug. The word trauma derives from the Greek term for wound, and in its original meaning it refers to a physical injury. In the current usage, though, trauma has come to mean a deep emotional wounding triggered by a profoundly distressing event or events. If that emotional wound is not addressed, then, like a physical injury, it can fester until it overwhelms a person's ability to cope, leading to the condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's an injury, not a disorder. Potentially traumatizing events are more commonplace than many of us realize or would like to know. Although the symptoms of PTSD have long been recognized, including among late 19th century women labeled hysterical and World War I soldiers diagnosed with traumatic neurosis and shell shock, the condition was only officially defined in 1980. This was thanks to the efforts of a group of Vietnam War veterans who returned the medals they had received for bravery, spoke openly about the atrocities they had committed and witnessed overseas, and demanded help for what was then called post-Vietnam syndrome. Responding to the veteran-led movement, lawmakers mandated that the Department of Veterans Affairs (VA) establish a psychological treatment program. The veterans' cause was further aided in 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association created a new diagnosis, PTSD, to explain what the former soldiers were experiencing. PTSD's inclusion in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, the so-called Bible of Psychiatry, finally legitimized a serious condition. For years after PTSD was established as a formal diagnosis, and despite a growing body of scientific evidence, some doctors and Western culture at large continued to push back against the idea that trauma can't just be willed away, and that victims are credible. PTSD was considered only to be a soldier's disorder. It took the women's liberation movement to raise awareness that violence and trauma are also staples of many women's and children's civilian lives. Feminist activists forced the medical establishment to acknowledge that rape, incest, childhood abuse, and domestic violence not only are prevalent, but also could all cause long-term trauma that belonged under the umbrella of PTSD. Doctors today accept that PTSD is not only real, but also a major public health crisis. People who have been traumatized, in whatever way, are changed forever, said Stephen Xenakis, a psychiatrist and retired brigadier general. In really severe cases, they can't work, they can't live with anybody, and they think about suicide every day. Mount Sinai's Rachel Yehuda and other experts have dedicated their careers to elucidating the biological mechanisms behind trauma's enduring shadow. In simplified terms, PTSD occurs when a person's nervous system becomes stuck, as though they are still experiencing a threatening event in real time. Like a deeply buried splinter that becomes infected, it's the body's reaction to the trauma rather than the traumatic event itself that causes the most harm. PTSD is about reorganization of your brain and mind, so it becomes very hard to fully engage with the present, said Bessel van der Kolk, the founder and medical director of the Trauma Center in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, and author of The Body Keeps the Score. The terror, the reactivity, the anger, and the threat live on inside your body. People with PTSD see and experience the world differently than non-traumatized individuals because their nervous systems have been fundamentally altered. They often have higher levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, and after a perceived threat has passed, their bodies continue to secrete those hormones for longer than a non-traumatized person's would. This is thought to result from heightened activity in the amygdala, the brain region associated with processing fear and danger, and lower activity in regions like the medial prefrontal cortex that suppress fear after a threat has subsided. When people with PTSD recall the trauma, activity decreases in Broca's area, a region of the brain responsible for speech. This could mean they are less able to put their thoughts and feelings into words. At the same time, activity lights up in parts of the visual cortex. People with PTSD, in other words, may be responding to the memory of the trauma as though it is actually happening to them again in real time. PTSD is also frequently associated with significantly lower activity in self-sensing areas, such as the anterior cingulate, the parietal cortex, and the insula. Shutting down activity in these areas allows a person to rid themselves of visceral feelings of terror and anger, but it also cuts them off from other emotions and the sense of feeling embodied. The clinical term for this is alexithymia, an inability to experience, talk about, or express emotion. Loss of activity in self-sensing brain regions also decreases a person's ability to self-regulate without the aid of crutches like alcohol or drugs. The earlier and more severe the trauma, the more ingrained these changes tend to become. The stress and exhaustion caused by PTSD and the brain changes it entails can snowball into other physiological problems, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue and pain, migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, cancer, heart attacks, and autoimmune issues. There's a huge link between trauma and medical problems, said Gabor Mate, a physician and author in Vancouver who specializes in trauma and addiction. Yet, the average medical student never hears about those links because the Western medical model separates the mind from the body and the individual from the environment. At the most basic level, some nervous system alterations seem to stem from epigenetic changes or shifts in how a person's genes function. If you think of your brain as a kind of a computer, the hardware, then epigenetics is the software, said Yehuda, who is at the forefront of research in this field. Genes contain our body's instruction manuals for making proteins, basic biological building blocks that perform crucial jobs ranging from transmitting signals to fighting diseases. But these instructions are not always expressed in the same way. They can be turned on or off by the addition or subtraction of certain molecules, altering the gene's function. Environmental triggers can influence how genes are expressed, and scientists suspect that traumatic exposures might be able to. As Mate wrote in The Myth of Normal, far from being the arbiters of our destinies, genes answer to their environment. The ability to flexibly respond to the environment is fundamentally adaptive and the basis of human resilience, Yehuda wrote. So, epigenetic plasticity can in itself be a good thing. Shifts in gene expression may help a soldier adapt to the conditions of war, for example, or a child to develop strategies to survive the hardships of an abusive household. But if genes don't reset to their normal expression after an environmental insult has passed, then these changes can become maladaptive and, over time, be deleterious to mental and physical health. The reason these dynamics are so tenacious is because they had an adaptive purpose in the first place, Mattei said. Once you associate something with survival, you're not going to give it up that easily. The consequences could extend from the individual to the next generation. In recent years, scientists have found that although epigenetic changes do not alter DNA, if they are present when a person's cells are dividing, including when they're making eggs or sperm, then they will be present in those new cells as well. This is one means of transmission for what researchers call multi- or intergenerational trauma. Trauma that gets passed down from family members who directly lived through to subsequent generations, like that which Naomi Fiske inherited from her Holocaust survivor parents. Intergenerational trauma can be caused by the behavioral repercussions of parents who suffer from trauma, by a mother's stress delivered to her fetus in the womb, or by epigenetic changes. Researchers are turning up more and more evidence for this. Yehuda found, for example, that the adult children of Holocaust survivors were more likely to develop PTSD if their mothers had the condition. She and her colleagues also found that mothers who had been pregnant and in New York City during 9/11 and who went on to develop PTSD gave birth to babies who had lower cortisol levels, a measure that has been linked in other studies to PTSD vulnerability. This persistent form of trauma can also reach beyond individuals to impact entire peoples or nations. Colonialism, for example, has left a legacy of multi-generational trauma that continues to impact Native peoples across North America, as has slavery and racism for Black Americans. PTSD is not homogeneous. PTSD caused by combat differs from PTSD triggered by surviving a discrete event such as a car crash or a hurricane, which does not compare in turn to deeply ingrained trauma stemming from chronic childhood abuse or neglect. There's a very good paper that says there's 630,000 permeabilities of how you can put things together to diagnose PTSD, Xenakis said. There's a really subjective aspect to it. Even so, trauma affects many more people than qualify for a PTSD diagnosis according to the DSM. Childhood trauma, in particular, is so radically different from trauma incurred during adulthood that 82% of children who are seen by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network do not meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Based on data collected from 20,000 traumatized children in 2009, Van der Kolk and colleagues proposed a new diagnosis for this group: developmental trauma disorder. That would provide a single label capturing the full range of traumatized children's symptoms. This is important, Van der Kolk wrote, because if doctors can't agree on what ails their patients, there is no way they can provide proper treatment. Disheartened to find that ever since Prozac hit the market in 1988, psychiatry had mostly abandoned therapy in favor of a pharmaceutical treatment paradigm. Mental health challenges had been recast as so-called disorders that could be fixed, not by the administration of appropriate chemicals. As Van der Kolk summarized of this shift, most psychiatrists welcomed the income and profits suddenly being generated for their profession by the pharmaceutical industry. The American Psychiatric Association rejected Van der Kolk and his colleagues' proposal, stating that no new diagnosis was required to fill a missing diagnostic niche. That niche, Van der Kolk pointed out, represents 1 million children who are abused and neglected each year in the United States and who make up the country's biggest and most costly public health issue, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Yet, the oversight has not been amended, and even today no diagnosis exists to represent traumatized children. PTSD, or complex PTSD, can stem from any event that threatens a person's life or physical integrity, or that otherwise makes them feel paralyzed by fear and helplessness. Although virtually every person will experience trauma or traumatic event at least once in their lifetime, not all of them will go on to develop PTSD. Scientists have identified a complex set of risk factors that may increase the chance of PTSD developing, including whether someone had an early history of trauma, whether any of their family members have had PTSD. 1 in 3 couples engage in physical violence. 1 in 8 children witnesses their mother being hit. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 38 men experience complete or attempted rape, and 1/4 of the population grew up with an alcoholic relative. Untold numbers of people in the United States and beyond suffer from war, mass shootings, terrorism, natural disasters, and accidents. As I write this, the collective trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic is also ongoing. Turn on the news and almost everything that is reported is a potential event that can trigger PTSD to many, said psychiatrist and neuroscientist Rachel Yehuda who directs the Center of Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research at the ICAHN School for Medicine at Mount Sinai.
Context of psychedelic psychotherapy for PTSD, which is a fairly recent focus for many of us. In almost any authoritative dictionary you might look at today, the definition of a psychedelic drug will reinforce the idea that these drugs might be dangerous. But it's really important to understand that there is a very long history of the use of psychedelics in many, many kinds of contexts. Most psychedelics are found in nature and are extracted from plants. And psychedelics have actually been used for thousands of years by shamans in indigenous cultures as part of healing rituals and spiritual journeying. So, for example, mescaline in the peyote has been used, dimethyltryptamine, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and of course psilocybin, the ingredient in magic mushrooms. And the purpose of taking these medicines in these indigenous cultures for healing rituals has really been to develop a sense of revelation, what we call a noetic experience, or a transpersonal state, meaning a transcendent experience. Now, more recently, there are synthetic compounds, synthetic psychedelic compounds, and these basically fall into two classes of drugs, the tryptamines, such as LSD, and phenethylamines, such as MDMA. And when you ask which drugs are included under the umbrella of psychedelic drugs, well, there are currently debates about which drugs are psychedelic. For example, is ketamine a psychedelic? Is cannabis? Those drugs are certainly mind manifesting, so it really depends on how broad you want to go when you're using this term psychedelic drug.
Researcher like you to kind of be introduced to such a revolutionary novelty in psychiatry or psychotraumatology, to be revisiting something that we may have known for a long time. But how is it that this turns up in your career that impresses you so much?
I think for a long time, I have been one of the people that have been less enthusiastic about the current status of our treatment approaches. We tried to do studies like the one we're doing with Yossi Zohar about preventing PTSD. In the beginning, my reaction was, oh, this is just another gimmick. But I think going to the training really able to talk to many people that have undergone the therapy. And also I got to experience it myself. Part of the training is you have an option to participate in an FDA approved protocol with therapists so that you can see exactly how this works, which was really helpful. I went in and understood it as well. And frankly, I couldn't believe it. I felt after the first 8 hours that I had just done 10 years worth of analysis. And it was gentle. Gentle but honest. I mean, all that's true. And so I thought, yep, I'm doing this.
Seemingly overnight, MDMA-assisted therapy has emerged in the popular imagination as a miracle cure for otherwise intractable cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in combat veterans, survivors of sexual violence and childhood abuse, and others haunted by past pain. But while clinical trial results do indicate that MDMA-assisted therapy significantly outperforms all existing treatments for PTSD, the issue is actually that many psychologists or psychiatrists are not really trauma-informed. So in the example of Lori, she saw a series of psychologists, psychiatrists, and even an endocrinologist but it never occurred to any of them, or to her, that she might have PTSD. I shit into bags, I spit into vials to test my hormones, she said. She tried acupuncture, meditation, and Reiki. She changed her diet and became a certified yoga instructor. This has a lot of similarities to my own experience. You just try to find your own solutions because you know something is not right as it should be. And then you try to find answers. But usually these methods just don't really help. And for me, even changing the diet, it was such an epiphany, because after 3 months, chronic pain just disappeared. The back pain I had experienced on a daily basis, just getting out of bed, having to sit down immediately until the back pain stopped, but then also not being able to stand for longer than 30 minutes at a time, having to sit down, so again the back pain would stop, but then again not being able to sit for long times, because then the tailbone would cause so much pain, stiffness in my hip. So it was really concerning, and a simple change in the way I was eating, it was all that was needed. And of course no doctor ever recommended that way of eating to me. I had to figure it out by myself, by trial and error, and really that change of diet was very, very powerful. However, a change of diet does not heal your trauma. It does not have this capacity. So I realized I had to dig deeper and search for other solutions in that regard. Same as Laurie. Still she could not find relief for the nameless affliction torturing her. There was something wrong with me, and no one knew what it was. Finally, one of the psychologists told her he thought she had pretty bad PTSD. However, what they keep suggesting is cognitive behavioral therapy, and trauma cannot be healed by talking about it. That's a complete misunderstanding. When Laurie tried CBT, she didn't get past the dissociation stage. It was like I was telling a story that wasn't mine. She said, it was like this happened and that happened, and I'm gonna go to the store after this and get grapes or whatever. Like at least 1/3 of all PTSD patients, Laurie dropped out of talk therapy. Even if she had stuck with it though, there's no guarantee it would have helped. In studies of those with PTSD, who do manage to get through a full round of CBT, only about 1 in 3 people show improvement. And then the next stupid approach is prescribing medication. SSRIs can blunt certain symptoms of PTSD, yes, such as depression and insomnia, but they do not address the root of a person's trauma and thus do not offer a cure. They also often come with unwanted side effects, ranging from sexual dysfunction and exhaustion to cognitive impairment and weight gain. And why I, as an artist, would never, ever take SSRIs. It prevented her from mustering creative inspiration or motivation. An unacceptable trade-off, given that she'd started working as a professional writer. It was like moving through jello at all times. She said, off the rug, she tried switching to Prozac and had a similar reaction, and she wound up staying on both drugs longer than she wanted because weaning herself off caused bouts of dizziness and nausea. Feeling nothing, that's like a psychopath. What forced me to want to kill myself was the pure absence of joy. Not even a depression. It was like an emptiness of being. So you are dead inside. Laurie was scrolling through Facebook one night when she saw an AD someone had reposted. It was from a group called MAPS, and they were seeking participants to take part in a phase 2 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted therapy to treat PTSD. Laurie clicked the link. Within 30 minutes of seeing it, I'd emailed them, she said. Following the clinical trial, Laurie's textbook PTSD symptoms, hypervigilance, mood swings, anxiety, poor sleep, sexual problems, suicidal ideation, and constant physical malaise either disappeared or significantly declined. Her relationships with loved ones are now deeper. She's fully present when she's with her son, and she feels more compassion and connection towards others, including strangers. It's not that MDMA-assisted therapy made her life perfect, or that she doesn't still get overwhelmed. The difference is, the perspective I gained in the trial never leaves me. MDMA specifically exerts its effect by binding to serotonin transporters and causing a novel action. It makes the vacuum-like transporters operate in reverse, dumping up to 80% of their stored serotonin into synapses rather than recapturing it. This burst of serotonin activates a subset of up to 14 different serotonin receptors, which in turn triggers the brain to release a flurry of other neurotransmitters and hormones, including oxytocin, sometimes called the love hormone. Oxytocin is implicated in interpersonal bonding and feelings of closeness and connection. As oxytocin serotonin and other natural chemicals ramp up under the influence of MDMA. Activity is reduced in the amygdala. So important, especially in a PTSD reactive amygdala, the brain's fear center, and increases in the prefrontal cortex, where information processing takes place. There is a case for saying that it changed some emotional sensibilities. People reported seeing men hugging in public for the first time, and class structures seemed to disappear on the dance floor. You'd get working class lads who go to football matches mixing with students, mixing with upper classes. It really was a grand leveler in that respect. According to popular lore, ecstasy even seemed to play a role in reducing violence. The sense of camaraderie and connection that ecstasy sparked, even if it's fueled by drug, it really is a beautiful thing. A lot of people spend most of their lives seeking that connection. Applied across hundreds of thousands of ecstasy users, the sense of connection began to subtly reshape British social norms. Similar to early British ecstasy culture's focus on camaraderie and connection, some US ravers adopted a behavioral and ethical framework called peace, love, unity, and respect, PLOR. It meant to foster safety and inclusivity in the community. PLOR was the motto of the rave scene.
MDMA effect is quite gigantic, 0.0001 with an effect size of 0.91 accounting for the psychotherapy. That's pretty good. Now in phase 2, we learned that these effects persist for up to 74 months, which is also unheard of in psychotherapy studies. Most people start creeping back. The side effect profile is very acceptable, very few dropouts in the study. And so the summary is 23% in the placebo group no longer meet PTSD, 56% no longer meet it at MDMA, but by 12 months later, people in the MDMA group continue to improve. So the process of integration is continuing to help people. And so study participants really have fantastic things to say, much like Arthur Shulgin. It's allowed me to really view this part of my life that we're talking about in a new way than I have before. And maybe one of the things the drug does is let your mind relax and get out of the way, because the mind is so protective about the injury. I got a glimpse more of what I'm capable of growing into, and I'm motivating to keep practicing openness until it gets more developed. That's the key. How does it work? I can pretend to tell you how it works, but my real answer is that we don't know that yet. Most literature on the effects of MDMA have focused on the negative effects of MDMA in the context of drug abuse, so we haven't heard anything from the literature in 20 years that would really help us understand why this isn't just bad for you. And that's a shame, because the literature is misleading in that the acute effects of serotonin depletion that people were suggesting were neurotoxic are really not harmful necessarily or related to any long-term neurotoxicity. We're going to have to do something we've been doing in my lab for 15 years, which is studying the biology of psychotherapy, because we're going to have to do that kind of integration. However, it does seem that MDMA might promote fear extinction and memory consolidation. So it might, we have to try to find biologic mechanisms that permit a state that is conducive to trauma-focused work. So not being afraid of your memories would definitely be important. MDMA may converge on pathways important for neuroplasticity, which might allow this continued effect of growing. And of course, there have been beautiful papers showing oxytocin-dependent reopening of social reward learning. And oxytocin in that whole pro-social feeling may be a very important key ingredient. So this is your brain on MDMA. You do see a reduction in the amygdala and increase in prefrontal cortex activity. But I'll conclude by saying that the integration of psychedelics and psychotherapy represents an exciting frontier. There are opportunities for scientific innovation. It's always important to revisit our ideas about how we've come to believe what we do. What's been easy is that many of us understand that we've been told things about MDMA and psychedelics that probably aren't true. We believed them for a long time. But the story of how MDMA was scheduled is a cautionary tale. It's important in general to look at things in a new way. And because that's what we're asking our patients to do with their traumas, look at things a new way. So we've got to do that as their providers.